and welcome to this regional webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Hana Asfour, Director of the Middle East Research Network on Internal Displacement, in short MERNID, which is supported by the Internal Research Program, Internal Displacement Research Program, School of Advanced Study, University of London. MERNID is a network that we've been setting up since the start of 2021. We're all researchers based in or work on the Middle East, and we also work to simulate, share, and produce research specifically on internal displacement in the Middle East region, including Afghanistan. We're doing this because, unlike the large quantity of research on refugees in our region, there's relatively little research on the equally important issue of internally displaced persons, or IDPs. If you're a researcher in our region and interested in joining MERNID, then please do send me an email after today's session. As moderator for this session, I'm pleased hereby to initiate the third series of seminars on internal displacement in the Middle East, which begins a conversation on the political identity of internally displaced persons through recent research on IDPs in Iraq and Syria. The Middle East region has experienced unparalleled waves of displacement over the past 10 years, which have been instigated by political instability across the MENA countries. Moreover, for many IDPs, their situation remains protracted for years and even decades. During displacement, people are greatly affected by religious, ethnic, and other identity markers as they attempt to accommodate to their new environments. The question underpinning this seminar are, what are the challenges to the provision of rights and protection for Syrians in and outside Syria, looking at the case of Lebanon? How do conceptualizations of citizenship and nationhood boundaries contribute to the development of different levels of belonging and membership in KRJ? And finally, the question of conceptions of youth identity before and after Daesh in Nineveh will also be examined. Each speaker will have between 10 to 12 minutes to present, and I hope you will forgive me in advance for policing this strictly. Given the tight frame, I'll also only briefly introduce each speaker, but their full biographies can be seen online following the link that appears now in the Zoom chat box that you bring up on the side of your screens. During the presentations, I would also like to ask you to pose your questions by typing them in the chat box too. I'd also like to ask the speakers to read through the chat box as we go along and to select questions to respond to once the panel presentations are completed. Finally, please do keep your microphones on mute and your videos off unless you are a presenter. We will also be recording this session, the podcast of which will be available next week on the IDRP website and the Researching Internal Displacement website as well. So without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker, Dr. Jasmine Lilian Diab, who is the Director of Institute for Migration Studies and Assistant Professor at the Lebanese American University in Beirut. Jasmine, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you everyone for the opportunity. I'm going to be discussing my paper on refuge and displacement, challenges to the provision of rights and protection for Syrians inside and outside Syrian borders, with a heavy emphasis, of course, on the Lebanese case. So to start with a bit of an overview, since the outbreak of the Syrian conflict close to a decade ago, more than a quarter of its population have fled the country to neighboring countries, predominantly Lebanon, but also Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey. And another 25% of its population have been internally displaced. And Lebanon hosts, of course, the highest proportion of refugees compared to its population worldwide. It currently hosts about 1.5 million Syrian refugees between those registered and unregistered. Of these, since the start of the civil war in Syria in 2011, more than 6 million are internally displaced and over 5 million have crossed the border into other countries, seeking asylum in Syrian refugee camps around the world. IDPs from Syria constitute some of the world's most vulnerable populations because, unlike Syrian refugees in neighboring countries, These IDPs have not crossed an international border to receive humanitarian protection and also to receive humanitarian aid. They've rather remained inside Syria as the conflict goes on for close to 10 years now. And despite the fact that they have fled from the same conflict, IDPs in Syria remain under the protection of the Syrian government, which places them in a very precarious situation in the areas of aid as well. So as citizens, they are considered entitled to their rights and protections under both human rights and international humanitarian law, and thus have a different legal standing to the Syrian refugees residing in Lebanon, interestingly, even though, of course, they are fleeing the same conflict as well. Interestingly enough as well, both IDPs and refugees are assisted by UNHCR. UNHCR implements very different modalities of delivery depending on the geographic location of these two groups, and this is how we are going to hopefully navigate this throughout the presentation in the eyes of international law and in the, of course, I would say, political realities within the international community as well. So how do we challenge the notions of protection and displacement through shedding the light on the Syrian case, and also while discussing definitions of refuge, of refugee, of IDP, of displacement in general in contemporary conflicts, because this not only affects access to services, but it also affects mobility and rights for displaced Syrians as well. So in the eyes of international law, when we talk about international protection, refugees have the 1951 Convention, and this remains, of course, the main source and the foundational legal document for the protection of refugees, along with its 1967 protocol. And what this provides refugees is a codified international legal document outlining not only the rights and duties of states towards refugees specifically, but also beyond this, in the areas of other human rights conventions and how they intersect with other international legal frameworks. The convention and its protocol provides for refugees very clearly outlined, I would say, guidances, in the areas of the refugee definition, the legal status, as well as states' obligations. On the other hand, for IDPs, despite international calls to establish, of course, one for over a decade now, to this day, there is no international convention for IDPs specifically that is equivalent to what the 1951 Convention for Refugees constitutes. Though the guiding principles, of course, on internal displacement, they seek to guarantee that IDPs as citizens or habitual residents of their country do enjoy some form of equality without discrimination and enjoy the same rights and freedoms under international and national law. The hindrances this places upon responding to one conflict makes it increasingly complex. So nevertheless, of course, international law and legal frameworks do provide for the protection of persons from displacement, as well as once they are displaced under multiple bodies of law. Despite not being the beneficiaries of one foundational convention, as we said is the case for refugees and migrants, IDPs are protected by various levels of law, including national law, human rights law, and international humanitarian law. According to the ICRC, the overwhelming majority of IDPs are nationals of the state in which they find themselves. So moving from this reality, they are entitled to the full protection of national law and the rights it grants its nationals without any adverse distinction. However, we find that in the Syrian case, due to the increasingly political complexities and the increasing, I would say, tensions inside Syria and the governance of different regions and how they are essentially split from each other almost entirely makes it very difficult for us to assess to what extent IDPs are in fact protected under national law and protected by their government. At another level, even though human rights law remains in effect, both in times of peace and in situations of armed conflict or protracted conflicts. This, of course, additionally outlines very pivotal protections for IDPs, but in application, what does this essentially mean? We definitely discuss here the prohibition from torture, the right to peaceful enjoyment of property and home and family life, but in these situations of protracted conflicts and in the situation whereby IDPs inside Syria are residing in similar camp-like situations to refugees across borders, how do we assess the applicability of this? How do we protect the IDPs if they essentially exist in the gray zone between being protected by their national governments and national law, and also not being protected by the International Refugee Convention because of its strict definitions there? Internally displaced persons in Syria currently, as I said, are around 6.5 million persons, of which 2.5 are children. They are all displaced, of course, within Syria, and a significant number of Syrians inside Syria continue to suffer from localized hostilities, from being displaced multiple times, from having their, of course, families separated, and also from not being able, of course, throughout the protracted conflict to make it to an international border or escape the local reality that they're currently enduring. The UN reports that as of 2021, up to 40% of internally displaced persons and their families have been displaced 2 or 3 times, with every wave of displacement, even, acting as an extra hindrance to their coping capacity and to the stability of their own situation internally. Recent displacement numbers are especially high for IDPs in the northwest and the northeast of Syria, where the majority of displacement movements were recorded, if I'm not mistaken, between 2018 and 2019 as well. Though typically tasked with the support of refugee populations, UNHCR's support to IDPs in Syria only began in 2012. There was a full year of the conflict before this actually took place. And at the moment, UNHCR, amid, of course, navigating these different government-controlled regions and non-government controlled regions, supports in the areas of protection, distribution, shelter assistance, health, educational support. But to a large extent, it operates in spite of the regime, in spite of the government-controlled areas, and in spite of all the hindrances in place. For Syrian refugees in Lebanon, as a comparison, this is very different. In Lebanon, the Syrian refugee community, of course, are faring worse than Lebanese citizens amid the current economic crisis. But globally, Lebanon is one of the countries that, of course, hosts the highest ratio of refugees to the native population and endures a lot of complexities there. The only thing that Lebanon would, I would say, provide in the areas of improved response in the areas of the Syrian conflict is that UNHCR operates with a lot more ease. UNHCR, of course, coordinates closely with the Lebanese government, but operates very much in the areas of the Syrian conflict almost alone. Why is this the case? This is the case because Lebanon to this day does not identify itself as a country of refuge, but rather, or a country of asylum, but rather a temporary, location for a temporary displaced population. They do not consider themselves a country of refuge, nor are they signatory to the Refugee Convention either. Due to the fact that Lebanon is not signatory to the Refugee Convention, this only binds them pretty much by the non-refoulement principle that the country has largely been upholding. As UNHCR continues to navigate this space, very much, I would say, independent from government interference to a large extent. Syrian refugees in Lebanon seeking shelter have been met with a no-camp policy that also the UNHCR navigates through. So it's very interesting for us to see that while international legal frameworks and mechanisms seem to oversimplify a particular situation, seem to lay the legal and foundational groundwork for us to comprehend what the situation of a refugee is and what the situation of an internally displaced population is, it at best presents the best case scenario. Refugees in Lebanon have the Refugee Convention, but they don't. IDPs in Syria have their national legal frameworks and their rights to basic human rights standards, but they don't. So this is where we seem to find that not only international legal frameworks are not being able to contextualize themselves to meet the needs of particular conflict, but that at times the spillover of a conflict across borders challenges our notions of international legal frameworks as well. To wrap up so that I stay within time, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this paper as you please. When we compare the management of something like COVID-19 across borders in different regions, both inside Lebanon for the Syrian refugees and inside Syria for IDPs, we find that governments to a large extent in both locations hinder the response, make it increasingly more complex, and that international mechanisms and international legal frameworks are not able to navigate the space adequately. as the government of Syria continues to serve as an impediment to the access of much humanitarian assistance in the government-controlled areas of Syria, and as the government of Lebanon continues to insist that it is not a country of asylum or refuge, but rather just a country in passing, this continues to not only challenge UNHCR and challenge international legal frameworks, but also exacerbates very particular vulnerabilities in intersectional crises like the ones we see today, whether it's the economic crisis going on in Lebanon at the moment, or COVID-19, or whether it's the fact that the Syrian crisis that everyone assumed would be very temporary, as was the approach of the government of Lebanon to the crisis in its early stages, is now in its 10th year. IDPs inside Syria fare differently depending on the region they are in as well. And they also fare differently depending on the extent to which humanitarian aid is permitted and accessible in these different regions. So while Syrian refugees have more of a wide access to humanitarian assistance by UNHCR, the internally displaced population in Syria, though helped by the same agency, does not enjoy the same, I would say, frequency of aid and access to aid as well. I think I'll leave my intervention there with these few hanging questions, and I'm happy to answer anything throughout the presentations. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Jasmine, for the informative presentation.
I tried.
No, it's interesting to hear about how national and international legal frameworks protect IDPs inside Syria in comparison to these frameworks that protect Syrian refugees in neighboring countries like Lebanon, and also the case of how access to protection depends on factors like where, you know, the regional the region that they're in and the extent to which humanitarian aid, you know, is accessible to them. So that definitely resonates in the research that I've been reading as well. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next speaker of this webinar, Atifa Ramsari, who is a PhD candidate at Bielefeld Graduate School of History and Sociology, Bielefeld University in Germany. Atifa, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Hana, and thank you, Yasmin, for your presentation. Yeah, my paper investigates how the implementation of the dynamic and interaction. Do you hear me? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
My paper investigates how the implementation of the dynamic interaction between citizenship and nationhood generates different levels of belonging and membership, and consequently many in between levels of inclusion and exclusion of displaced people. By taking the case of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, a federal semi-autonomous subject of Iraq, this research aims to answer how displaced groups, including Iraqi Arabs who hold the citizenship status in Iraq, compared to non-Iraqi Kurds who are nominally citizens of neighboring countries like Iran, Syria, and Turkey, experience exclusion through defining their membership. After years of conflict following the Gulf War in 1990 until 1991, Iraqi Kurds finally achieved autonomy when the coalition forces led by the United States enforced a no-fly zone in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan. After the uprising against Saddam Hussein's regime in 1992, the first parliamentary and presidential election were held, and the Kurdistan region government, a new semi-autonomous government of Kurdistan in Iraq, was established. Since the collapse of the Hussein in 2003, the KRG has experienced extensive constitutional changes, and in the meantime, it began rebuilding infrastructures. Based on the oil industry, the economy blossomed, and new job opportunity and investment possibilities attracted a huge number of people from different backgrounds, including Kurds from Iran, Turkey, and Syria, and Arabs from other provinces of Iraq. At the same time, due to pervasive struggles in the region, particularly Syria's civil war, internal conflicts in Iraq, and the recent invasion of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. Seeking a shelter, most people fled to the Kurdistan region as the closest and safest area in the north of Iraq. In 2017, Iraq was Iraq, with 2.6 million persons, had the fourth highest rates of internal displacement. However, since then, a part of these groups have returned, around 78% due to lack of social security and livelihood opportunities are still displaced. This intersection of the intersection of citizenship and national boundary emerges as a critical issue in the Kurdistan region, where displaced Arabs traverse the Kurdish national boundaries, and the refugee Kurds or migrant Kurds from Turkey, Iran, and Syria or other places move across the Iraqi nation-state borders. This work is built on a body of literature that purposefully identifies and reflects on the disjunction of citizenship and nationhood. Here, I don't want to just delve into the theories. I want just to skip this part, and just I want to mention that by delving into various views, 4 emphasized characteristics of a citizenship concept are figured out: legal status, rights, political participation, and a sense of belonging. These characteristics of citizenship or dimension of citizenship are here theoretically important, and later they are methodologically also important because I use them as a criteria for experience to note for exploration how citizenship and nationhood are experienced. The overarching aim of this research is to explore how the dynamic and implementation of interaction between national identity and citizenship regulation create or extend boundaries and subsequently affect individual lives and expand inequality between displaced groups. In regard to the methodology, this study is a qualitative comparative case study of 2 ethnic groups. The first one are the non-Iraqi Kurds, and the second one are Iraqi Arabs who have been in Kurdistan region or who lived there for a while. The participants are selected by using snowball methods among the members of this group who are currently living there, or as I said, they have lived there for a while. For collecting data, semi-structured interviews were applied. The result shows that in terms of legal status, Arabs are identified as formal citizens of Iraq, but in the Kurdistan region, they are classified and need to be registered as external migrants. In the same way, the non-Iraqi Kurds in recent deal ought to apply for short-term permission as foreign migrants. This group had no clear perspective to officially be recognized as a citizen of Iraq. In relation to the right, the Kurdish group had the right to select the residence place, to travel inside the region without restraint, to own privately, and to make a family. Member of this group has access to job market and also the juridical system. But one of the limitations for this group is the restriction to advanced study in higher education. Looking at the other side, the Arab participants report various obstructions in process of residence places selection, traveling between the cities, owning properties, finding a job, and studying in higher level of education are the main factors or main criteria that the main rights that they have been excluded. The group are granted the right to make family and to filing a case in court. Concerning political participation, none of these groups were officially involved in the process of making political decisions. Looking at the sense of belonging, a significant discrepancy regarding how and to what extent the Arabs and Kurds feel belonging to Kurdistan region society is recognizable. Referring to the defined criteria, it can be claimed that Arabs, in contrast to non-Iraqi Kurds, have no sense of belonging to Kurdistan, not as a nation nor as a federal subject of Iraqi nation state. Based on expression, Kurdish individuals represent a strong sense of belonging to Kurdistan, both in cultural and social terms, and even as a national territory. The result revealed that belonging to the nation remains influential as long as it was a symbolic precondition for inclusion into the Kurdish society, moreover for achieving certain rights. The Kurdish participant expressed a sense of belonging to the Kurdish nation as a political entity with a unique identity. According to inspection of the situation of two ethno-national groups based on main dimensions of citizenship, it can be claimed that citizenship cannot be that apparatus for inclusion and equality of individuals with different backgrounds, confronting the internal displaced Arabs and interstate migrant courts. Both groups experience various forms of exclusion in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. In multinational states like Iraq, citizenship fundamentally lacked the capacity of granting access to resources, to social rights, or to democratic political representation. Holding citizenship status of a nation state for people who are internally displaced in its borders could not guarantee the full entitlement of rights. But lacking this status can exclude those who are not recognized as a citizen. Investigation of membership regime in Kurdistan region of Iraq confirms how critical a study on citizenship must be underlined when inspecting the marginalization of internally displaced persons. This case study tells us in multi-layer political entities, when individuals are displaced inside their origin state, the risk of losing right is possible and they may not be able to enjoy the whole rights already had. Following the exploration of the situation of these two ethno-national groups, we can conclude that in a semi-autonomous political unit such as the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where citizenship boundaries intersect with ethnic boundaries, legal citizenship doesn't definitely ensure substantial rights for Arab citizens, while officially exclude migrant courts. And the challenge of citizenship in the Kurdistan region of Iraq involved defining boundaries by state making and applying these boundaries in practice, as well as the discordant outcome of implementation of formal boundaries made by the Iraqi and central government. Going beyond the official marginalization in the Kurdistan region, the setting's exclusionary social relation result in the ongoing conflict over who belongs to the community and to what extent this belonging facilitates access to resources. Both groups in this study experienced exclusion emanated from the type of membership and belonging they have. The important implication of the citizenship concept in studying internal displacement is that where a state bonds different national groups, citizenship doesn't provide an internal displaced person inside the border of state with full access and social acceptance. Further, it deprives the groups who moved into the border of their nation to be a full member of the community. I think here I can stop. Later, I will come back with more details if required.
Great. Thank you, Atifa, for this very informative presentation. It was interesting to hear how you talk about inclusionary and exclusionary forms of citizenship and how they are applied in both Iraq and KRG cases, and how ethnicity plays an important role in creating a sense of belonging. Thank you for this. Moving on to the next speaker.
Something happened, sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
Dr. Kamran Palani, who's the final speaker of this webinar, and he is a lecturer in politics and international relations at Salahuddin University in Erbil. Kamran, over to you.
Thank you so much for you organizing this important discussion, and also for the colleagues for sharing these really informative presentations about different contexts. First of all, can you all hear me well and also see the screen? Just, okay, thank you, great. My presentation is really is about what the changes happened in the identity formation of young generation youth in Mosul, the de facto capital of Daesh before and after Daesh. And I'm particularly interested in how displacement has influenced the populations of Mosul as the city and the capital of the Nineveh province, and specifically the youth component of the Moslawi city. This presentation, the findings and the discussions, my discussions, are part of were part of a research project produced by an Italian organization called UPP, Unparalleled, within the Nineveh Return Program of the Maltese International. The methodology of the research, by the way, I can share with you all the final version of the report after the discussion today. It's the discussions and the findings of the report relied on a mixed methods approach, interviews, FGDs, and survey. The main really purpose was to provide an empirical analysis in the changes have been occurring in youth's identity formation, the perceptions towards traditional and existing ethno-religious identities in Mosul, and importantly, their participation in civil society as a peaceful resistance and response to their disappointment with the authorities in the province. I'm sure you are all familiar with the with what happened to Mosul, became the capital of Daesh in 2014, and it was liberated in summer 2017. So during these years, the majority of the population displaced to different places, mostly to the Kurdistan region. And Mosul, as the capital of the Nineveh province, is a very diverse territory, is a very diverse location. Almost all ethno-religious components and communities and groups you have in Iraq, you can find in this place as well. It is important to say that the emergence of Daesh in 2014 exacerbated, ethno-religious sectarian divisions in this region. 4 years after the retaking or liberation of Mosul from Daesh, ethno-religious identities are still central to how people formulate and define their identities and actions in the region. However, this is where my presentation starts. There is a parallel trend of an emerging youth in Nineveh, how they define their identity and how they see their participation in civil society, and they are defining their identity more based on a common national Iraqi identity than ethno-religious sectarian identity. So that's the key change, the major change that not only this research found that, but also other researchers working in Mosul on the ground are sharing the same conclusion. So there is a significant change on how the younger generation of Mosul who were displaced during the ISIS, the Daesh control from 2014 to 2017, they were displaced to Kurdistan region, to Kurdistan, to other places. And during displacement, they found new opportunities and they were introduced with new cultures, new ways of life. And then when they came back to Mosul after 2017, so they began questioning the traditional identity formation in the city. That this change is not only important for this specific region, but it's also important to understand how displacement can also impact the process of identity formation and self-identification. Before 2014, it is very, I'm sure, obvious for all of us that Mosul witnessed the rise of a very polarized, divisive narrative around religion, sect, and ethnicity. It created a very difficult environment, which younger generation or younger population of the city were particularly affected by radicalization towards extremism and violence. And extremism and violence in the city during the period 2003 to 2014, created further difficulties for the younger population to access education, to educate and to mobilize themselves. So that was the context before 2014. Here are some results from the survey. If you look at the question for the pre-2014 context regarding the position of religion in the life of people, specifically younger generation, youth, you see 86% believe that religion did play an important role. And then if you look at the result after 2017, you see there is some change. But more interestingly, the change happened in the next slides and results that I'm going to show you. After 2017, I have to revise this. Our data indicates a change in youth's identity formation and self-identification across ethno-religious backgrounds. More young people now mention Iraqi national identity as their basis of identity, and the shared experience of conflict and displacement during this period, 2014-2017, has created greater exchange and knowledge of the different communities. We had a specific question about the perceptions towards other communities, whether displacement impacted any change in their perceptions. So there is a narrative highlighting political and traditional religious authorities, mismanagement and corruption in Mosul. This is very dominant among younger generation. They are really disappointed with the traditional ethno-religious tribal authorities in the region. If you look at this question, I think this is an interesting figure. Do you think young people's perceptions of religion have changed after ISIS? The 80%, more than 80% responded yes. And when we asked them what changed, and they mentioned the younger population, the youth, have become more moderate in terms of their outlook and perceptions towards practicing and interpreting religion. And again, the role of religion in forming identity, you see there are still people, including youth, refer to ethnicity, geography as important components of identity formation even before and after ISIS. But there is a change, important change in more younger generation look at Iraqi national identity as the main source of their identity formation and less about religion. And a specific question about marriage with other ethno-religious communities. I mentioned that Mosul, as the city within the province of Nineveh, is the place where all ethno-religious groups live, including Christians, Yazidis, Turkmens, Kakais, Kurds, Arabs, Shia, and Sunni. So the marriage is a very important indicator to explain the relations between these communities. Again, there is a slight change in how the youth sees, such activity within and between communities. And again, this slide and the results show that the youth has become more aware of the identities and sensitivities of other ethno-religious communities. Sunni Arabs, young Sunni Arabs became more aware about the identity of Yazidis in Sinjar. The same thing happened to, Christians have become more aware about the other groups. So in general, even when I was in Mosul a few weeks ago, I found that it's becoming quite, common that people talking about the identity and sensitivities and what is fundamental for the other group, and they all refer to the crisis of displacement, to what happened during displacement. They have their perceptions towards each other changed positively. So what all this means, the results and the change in youth's identity formation, I will make it very simple. I think this is the moment for so many years, specifically after 2003, identification with ethno-geographical sectarian identity. It was a key driver for insecurity, communal tensions, communal competitions, etc., which actually created an environment conducive to the emergence of Daesh. At the moment, in these regions, specifically in Mosul, and within the youthful component of the society, we are witnessing a change in how they define their identity, less based on sub-ethno-religious identity, more on broader national identity, with the specific emphasis on the word of civicness, madaniya. These are changes happening within the youth, really require significant attention from all the stakeholders working in this part of the region. And the first major policy recommendation is towards the existing local and international NGOs. First of all, they should recognize the change, and they should scale up their initiatives at all levels to involve young people in all the programs and activities. So my first recommendation is that we should recognize the change happening and why it is relevant not only for Mosul, but also for the broader country. And then again, there is a disconnect between what's happening in Mosul and with what is seen as interest in Baghdad in the central government. That the changes, the positive changes, have to be recognized, and not only by local and international NGOs working in this field, but also by the federal government of Iraq, in order to transform the changes into more lasting support for peace building. Otherwise, the region will remain vulnerable to, as I've said from the beginning, still the forces that are promoting to sectarian divisions are there, the pulling factors and actors. So if they don't witness they don't see the moment emerging among the youth in this vulnerable place in the country, which is quite symbolic as the capital of Daesh. And now you are witnessing a younger population sharing positive perceptions towards each other, towards other communities, and also they appreciate the role in local civil society as a way to enhance their participation in local decision making. This has to be felt at the Iraqi government level and transform into actions. I will stop from here, and I'm happy to explain more about the communal, relations between Arabs, Christians, Yazidis, and how different displacement experiences have contributed to these changes. And in the previous presentation, Atifa talked about the different practices towards the Sunni Arabs and Kurds from Rojava or from Northeast Syria, but also I have been witnessing different practices towards different ethno-religious groups and communities. You know, at the checkpoint, there is a specific practice towards a specific community. You know, when you go to the residency department, there is a different treatment with different communities. So and Mosul has become the center of all these different and conflicting practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamran, for the interesting discussion. So thank you to all three speakers. You've now heard from our panel, and I would now like to move on to the questions that have been posed. So speakers, I think we have around 3 questions in the chat box. Or 4. You are welcome to address which questions you feel you're best placed to answer. So I'm going to go to our speakers by turn. I think Jasmine got dropped off because of the internet connection in Lebanon. So I'll turn to Atifa. Would you like to answer or respond to any of the questions in the chat box, please?
Yes, thank you, Hana. I'm reading your question as the first question, if I'm right. And before answering your question, I would like just to correct Kamran that my research is not categorizing Arabs into Shia or Sunni or either Kurds into Rojava, Syrian Kurds or Iranian. I have just 2 categories. Iraqi Arabs and non-Iraqi Kurds. So it makes more sense because otherwise I have to go deeper and just explain more about this classification. But I will stick to our subject today and will answer you, Hana, if how Syria and countries like Syria and Iraq, which we can name the multi-ethnic countries, can overcome the problem of social exclusion. I would say that overcoming or having more social cohesion in these countries is really complicated, and sometimes I'm disappointed to find this just giving a simple solution, because when Iraq was established in 1932, it was established as an Arabic. Both Syria and Iraq were established as Arabic countries by protection of British forces. So they ignored all other ethnic groups in these countries, in these territories. I mean, Kurds and other ethnic groups in these both of these countries, newly established countries, have been ignored. And then since then, we have these political conflicts between Arabs and Kurds and other ethnic groups in these countries. And finding a solution, it could be not a social solution, but a political one. Because in these countries, the membership into the society is not only citizenship or a national membership, but it's kind of ethnic and religious membership. It's a kind of conditional membership in these countries. So when we have this conditional membership, we could think about other kind of membership without any condition, based on human being or human rights memberships, not kind of being ethnically membered or being religiously membered. So until we have this kind of differentiation and classification of people based on their ethnicity or based on their religion, it will be too hard to solve this problem of the membership. And citizenship makes another burden, because citizenship for example, in Iraq have been defined based on the Arabic identities. So for long time, Kurdish people, Iraqi Kurdish people, I mean, have been excluded in political and social affairs in Iraq. And just, I think from 2003, Kurdish people have been officially recognized as a group having political identity and political power. So these tensions will be going on until we will have a kind of membership and conditional membership in these countries. And maybe Yasmin is there and she can follow and answer your question, and I will come back by the next questions.
Thank you, Atifa. Jasmine, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
No,
Yes.
it's okay. We have a question for you regarding how the experience of forced displacement, whether internal or external, impacts on how those who have displaced feel a sense of belonging, especially as citizens of their nation. Does the impact on how these nations themselves conceive themselves? In other words, does mass forced displacement reshape the way a nation sees itself?
Thank you so much for your question. I'm so glad that I was able to come back in time. Well, I mean, first and foremost, based on the case study that I'm discussing, which is the Syrian case, it's very interesting to find how many national identities there are to begin with. So it's very fascinating when we talk about the sense of belonging, because throughout the Arab world and throughout the Middle East, our notion of belonging is very tied to political realities, it's very tied to sectarian and religious realities, and it's very, I would say, rarely tied to, especially in countries like Syria, like Lebanon, to the state itself and having a national identity or a sense of belonging there. The sense of belonging is very rooted in a community level belonging. Moving from this point, different groups that are displaced across the different regions of Syria identify very differently with the regime itself and identify very differently with what it means to be Syrian. So their notion of belonging is very interesting, I would say, to debate, and very up for debate as well. I will find that the notion of belonging is a lot stronger once this displacement happens across borders. So for the Syrian refugee community in Lebanon, I have found to a large extent that we discuss the notion of belonging a lot more among this community, because definitely they do not feel Lebanese and they do not feel very welcome due to the policies that are, of course, very ad hoc and very reactionary in Lebanon when it comes to these populations. So their understanding and their notion of belonging is definitely a lot, I would say, intense or a lot more realistic for refugees across a border. In my conversations with persons internally displaced inside Syria, whether through organizations or some of my own work and my research, their understanding of belonging has been heavily tainted by conflict and by being displaced multiple times. Some of them ending up in regions of Syria that they don't necessarily call home or don't feel like they belong in or identify in. So they are looking for a way out, mostly. For individuals that leave their country, for example, take the Palestinians, for instance, this notion of wanting to go back and of belonging intensifies once you cross an international border. So I hope that answers your question. For those internally displaced, it's a very, I would say, interesting topic to follow. There's no one answer there, but the internal displacement across many stages, and you essentially looking around even within your own country and not feeling like you belong in the community where you've been displaced to, has played a lot, I would say, into the Syrian community's sense of belonging there.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you. Definitely, I feel like also humanitarian aid plays a role in the case of Syrian refugees, and creating a sense of belonging or not belonging, because it can create social, the opposite. I mean, like friction in terms of between refugees and host communities. You know, intensifying the sense of non-belongingness towards these refugees. Kamran, there is a question for you. Do you think older people react to the experience of forced displacement in the same way as do youth, or are the findings you presented specifically only to youth?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Actually, the paper, the findings and the survey were mostly, specifically with the youth, but I can make some maybe subjective and qualitative observations. The change has mostly occurred within two components. One is youth, and then the other woman. And we have had a specific report about the impact of displacement on women and the role in society. For the older people, it is very hard to find the evidence, and also it's useful to say that the older generation witnessed different socio-political economic mobilizations. Most of them grew up under the Saddam regime, so their perceptions towards other communities really influenced by the memories and the education and mobilization of the Saddam regime. The younger generation, the youth, experienced a different political mobilization, and when they were displaced, they were introduced. I have spent a significant time in this period in the IDP camps in Erbil and Duhok, where I saw different local and international organizations, training the members of these camps, specifically youth and women. They train them, they give them opportunities to access different opportunities. I think these were fundamental in changing their perceptions when they came back. I would link the second question to this. I don't see really still ethno-religious sectarian identity is still very strong in Iraq. Kurds define themselves as Kurds, and then maybe the last thing as Kurds of Iraq. So that's how they define themselves. And then the same thing for the rest of communities. But what is changing, which is significant, is the demands of the younger, youthful component of the Iraqi society. The demands are changing. So they are demanding better governance, functioning governance, better services, more job opportunities. So these demands have also shaped how they define their membership. Are they member of this small subnational community, or are member of broader place seeking and demanding the same conditions and the same demands? So the change in demands is also useful in understanding how the youth also defines and formulates their identity in Iraq.
Thank you, Kamran. We have one more question. I'm sorry, I'm just because of the time, so we can, there is one question for Jasmine, if you're able to respond. It's in, the question, it looks at, in Turkey, the availability of work permits for Syrian migrants determine to a great extent the nature of work available for them, and subsequently can determine whether they're exploited or not. How much influence do local work permits or other work barriers have on IDPs in Syria?
Thank you very much for this question. I think it's also pertinent to compare this reality to the Lebanese reality as well. For IDPs inside Syria, to my knowledge, they have a very similar experience as refugees do in Lebanon, in that they are restricted to working in particular areas and particular sectors. What this essentially means that for the mere fact that they are IDPs displaced from one region to the next, likely across government and non-government controlled areas, or whether they are displaced across an international border, that they are restricted to work in specific sectors like agriculture, construction, et cetera, et cetera. These restrictions on their labor have really been tested, if we want to contextualize it to the present, during the COVID-19 experience, whereby these daily workers, so IDPs that move from one region to the next, sometimes overnight, and cannot sustain a full-time job or a regular job, or refugees that are also in similar experiences in Lebanon, how their daily income actually was completely halted. These are individuals that got paid for a day's work. So their type of work and the sectors that they are restricted to, as well as the legal restrictions of what that meant in Lebanon and inside Syria, meant that they did not have an income. Beyond that, what that meant is that it essentially exacerbated all the vulnerabilities in the areas of their livelihoods, their mental health, their physical well-being, and their ability to also, I would say, protect themselves from COVID-19. In Lebanon, this also meant that they could not protect themselves from the ongoing economic crisis that was already putting us all at risk and putting us all at risk of poverty as well. It was a very sensitive situation for us to handle. And also because of the COVID-19 restrictions, a lot of these individuals were either working for businesses that closed down or working for businesses that were closed during COVID for precautionary reasons. Inside Syria, this has been the experience, at least with the NGOs that I had spoken to. A lot of grassroots organizations that worked with a lot of grassroots actors and Syrian networks, they would explain to me that due to COVID-19 restrictions, not only was everybody very difficult to reach and inaccessible and essentially, you know, in hiding, but a lot of internally displaced persons are on the move regularly, so they are already difficult to catch. So when we talk about the entire restrictions on labor force and on the sectors that IDPs and Syrian refugees can work in, it intersects with so many other things. It's that not only do these restrictions exacerbate, of course, their vulnerability, but they're also at the mercy at a lot of other things such as COVID-19 and the economic crisis as well. So it is a very big question, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to dive into it, but I hope that kind of frames it for you. So the restrictions to the sector and the permits also exacerbate other vulnerabilities. And anytime there is a crisis, whether economic or health or political, they are the most vulnerable and the most at risk. I know we're running out of time, but thank you so much for your question.
Thanks a lot, Jasmine. Well, it has been an excellent discussion, but it looks like that's all we have time for. Allow me to draw proceedings to a close by expressing my thanks to our 3 fantastic presenters today, and also to each one of you participating remotely for a great session. We look forward to seeing you for the next seminar in this series on internal displacement and economic security, which will take place in February 2022. To join us, please check the events page on the Researching Internal Displacement website in January for the event details. Until then, thank you and goodbye.